All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending. My name is Justin, and today I'd like to revisit depth psychology and its connections to psychedelic medicine. Now, before we begin, I provided a brief outline of this presentation. I will start with an introduction to myself, hoping to kind of frame my reasoning for developing and delivering this talk. And then I'll move into a bit of a primer on depth psychology so we can kind of better understand what it is and how and when it relates to the psychedelic experience. And then I'll suggest where I think that a failure to consider depth psychology might be harmful. And I'll highlight a few concepts that kind of tie the fields together. And then after that, we'll kind of look forward. So this is me. Um, I will give you a short summary of mostly my educational background to explain what leads me to this. So in 2021, I began a master's level program in biomedical engineering, and I concentrated in neuroengineering at Drexel University. And at this time, I also served as the secretary of Drexel's Neuroscience Society. So I was big into the neuroscience kind of aspect of engineering. And it was also during these graduate years that I co-founded and served as Drexel's Students for Sensible Drug Policy chapter. And I did that mainly in an effort to better familiarize myself with the political and the scientific landscape surrounding drug use, harm reduction, and more specifically, psychedelic therapy. And at this point, I had plans to study psychedelic medicine pretty directly after my schooling, but sometime after graduating, I fell deeper into an interest with depth psychology, a subfield of psychology. And I decided to study it at the master's level to better understand its connection to both the current academic landscape of psychology and also to human creativity. And I'm currently finishing my first year at Pacifica Graduate Institute, and it's been very lovely. And I do intend to pursue a PhD if I'm given the opportunity. So, what I kind of quickly realized was that depth psychology gave me a language to describe what I felt had been missing from my previous and more technical education. And I found that it considered the psyche more holistically, and it provided me with psychological model of sorts that kind of blended clinical science with the humanities and with philosophy. And I also remembered that in my own education and even in my minor in psychology that I did during my undergrad years, depth psychological ideas and figures were kind of rarely mentioned, if at all. And so, with all this in mind, the goal of this presentation is to simply illuminate some of the connections between depth psychology and psychedelic therapy, kind of, selfishly, even if only um, to better understand those things myself. So, depth psychology itself, as I mentioned, is a subfield of psychology, and it has its roots in the discipline's earlier years. And it's the type that most associate with Freud, with Jung, and with Adler. And they're sometimes referred to as the big three of depth psychology. And in simple terms, it considers psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approaches to psychotherapy and kind of aims to change the conscious attitude of the patient through insight. What really sets it apart, though, is its value on the irrational and the unconscious aspects of the psyche. And it suggests that these things greatly affect our behavior. Now, today we've kind of largely grown past the psychoanalytical approach to therapy, but I do believe that we can afford to revisit depth psychology and its ideas and its concepts in order to better understand how those apply to us today, if at all, given the wider range of psychotherapeutic methods available. And this talk specifically focuses on Jungian psychology, which I think is the strongest branch of depth psychology, as I think it considers the psyche the most holistically. Now, culturally, we find ourselves at a point where we have developed therapeutic models that favor rationality and conscious kind of top-down approaches to psychotherapy. And cognitive behavioral models, as well as those derived from cognitive behavioral therapies, currently exist as the gold standard of psychotherapy, and they've been shown to work for many people, many populations, and pretty well. But in my opinion, they are kind of incomplete. And I'll add kind of a caveat here that I've kind of mm, gotten a lot of personal help from cognitive behavioral interventions, but I found that they are quite limited. And I think because of their common emphasis on challenging conscious thoughts, I think they fail inherently to adequately consider the totality and more importantly, the irrationality of the psyche. And as a result, I think we remain vulnerable to things like ignorance, intellectualization, and avoidance in confronting psychic kind of disturbances. Now, this can be a problem because failure to consider unconscious material shuts us off from potentially valuable information for us. Carl Jung stresses that the importance of bringing as much psychic information and material to consciousness is critical. And he refers to our tendency to kind of attribute fate to what might just be adherence to behaviors guided by unconscious drives. He's also mentioned the importance of moving beyond conscious knowledge, right, into the realm of like lived embodied experience, which can sometimes transcend our bias toward rational and logical processing to a degree. And depth psychology aims to address this by promoting methods of effectively dialoguing with the unconscious mind, kind of bridging that split between consciousness and unconscious material. And then finally, he notes that a resistance to the unconscious itself for any reason can lead us to avoid our biggest problems, which can then lead us to develop neuroses that keep us away from truly experiencing life. And in neglecting to turn an eye toward our unconscious mind and kind of the unique and personal and also collective material that exists for us within it, we can fail to develop as humans and grow past our problems. Now, the idea that really connects this field to psychedelic medicine is that unconscious material tends to surface to consciousness in non-ordinary states of consciousness. This idea is stressed in this quote by Dr. Rick Strassman, but I think it's probably the most intuitive idea associated with these two fields. I think it's clear that psychedelics can open an individual up to emotional states, to memories, and even to experiences with like autonomous figures in the psyche that feel inherently meaningful. And I think that depth psychology offers us insight into the personal and the collective relevance of this dimension of life. And I think that provides us with the therapeutic tools then and models to kind of consider material that cognitive behavioral ones will or can't really effectively breach. Now, if that is the case, then we ought to be able to understand how to best interface with those unconscious elements when they do breach consciousness, either as a practitioner or a patient in the context of psychedelics. And I think that failure to do so kind of limits the breadth of therapeutic practices available during clinical experiences. I think it also distances psychedelic medicine from any of its step psychological roots or connections over time. And then I think it also further displaces the irrational dimensions of the psyche and instead reinforces our cultural preference for intellectual approaches to psychology. Now, I do want to highlight here that there are modern therapeutic modalities that offer irrational approaches to the psyche. You can think of somatic work. You can think of even like internal family systems. I'm sure there are plenty more. And that's great, and that's absolutely a step toward completeness. But I'm curious to know whether it might be useful to more directly open up to the depth psychological language and the concepts within it, uh, especially as they relate to psychedelics. And if so, what concepts might be related to the psychedelic experience? And then how might those concepts be related to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, if at all? So the first big overlap between the two fields is the emphasis on numinosity. And Jung defined a numinous experience as one that causes a peculiar alteration of consciousness. And usually something described as numinous carries with it a religious or like a spiritual quality and often includes the feeling of some sort of divine presence. So numinous experiences, because of that reason, tend to connect us with something kind of unknowable. And then as a result of that, they can strongly affect our conscious attitude, right? So psychedelic experiences are inherently numinous just based on what they do to the psyche. And this is probably the most obvious connection, again, between Jungian ideas and psychedelic therapy. Now, depth psychology suggests that this numinous sensibility is inherently human and that our relationship to this numinous quality is relevant to our psychological health. And Jung went on to say that his psychoanalytic work was perhaps most concerned with addressing the patient's approach to the numinous and that that itself is the real therapy, which is interesting. And in this frame, it might be worth then reflecting on our personal and our collective relationship to the numinous, including what we call mystical experiences and those that are associated with psychedelics, so we can better understand the role that they play in healthy and pathological presentations. Now, to bring this back into the realm of psychedelic therapy, Coe and colleagues have found that mystical experience was a predictor of improved clinical outcome. And if this is the case, then we can begin to understand that numinous experiences might be a medicine in themselves. And um, as a result of that, we're kind of encouraged to open up to these wordless experiences that can so profoundly change us and challenge us. And we might then be able to view psychedelic therapy as a method that kind of directly informs um, our ongoing relationship to the numinous, and then conversely, cultivating an openness to numinous experiences, especially prior to psychedelic dosing, might better prepare one to experience them and learn from those kind of experiences. And also, following this line of thought, you might be able to now see how our psychological well being can be so heavily affected or influenced by things that are irrational and thus kind of immeasurable and individualized. Now, depth psychology also allows us to consider the language of the psyche, and Jungian thought emphasizes symbols, archetypes, and complexes as kind of methods of communication between the unconscious and consciousness. It suggests strongly that this psyche inherently prefers metaphorical and symbolic imagery and even archetypal references in kind of making sense of the inner and outer world. Now, pictured here are tarot cards. I think they're kind of an imperfect but inadequate example of archetypal images that seem to transcend time. McGovern and colleagues have also highlighted that archetypal images and themes are present in psychedelic and dream states. Um, you might be familiar with anecdotal experiences that report an interaction with machine elves during DMT dosing, which I think is fascinating. Um, it might be that these figures have connections to archetypal tricksters or jesters or fools or something of that variety. And this is just one example of an archetypal kind of encounter, but it suggests that the presence of these figures, they might be symbolic or inherently kind of illustrative of some individual psychic truth. And understanding that might make an experience then additionally meaningful or insightful. And then it's also possible that psychedelic experiences can open us up to encounters with some of the more well-known archetypes, namely the shadow or the self. And in this case, psychedelic experiences can show us things that we've been avoiding, and they can be almost gateways of sorts to better understanding the components of the self and their presentation within the individual personality. So to bring this kind of together, Les Stein, who is a Jungian author, he suggests that Jungian approaches can help one interpret their psychedelic experiences and then better prepare them for encounters during those numinous experiences. And I agree. I think that strong experiences like psychedelic ones can be difficult to metabolize and integrate into daily life without language or concepts precise enough to capture them, right? And I think that's partially what depth psychology offers. Finally, the concept of individuation is a strong one in Jungian schools of thought. The term generally refers to a level of self-actualization that life inherently kind of pushes us or pulls us toward. And I think that psychedelic therapy can aid in our movement toward individuation and vice versa. To kind of break this concept down, you can generally think of individuation as the psyche's kind of inherent desire for wholeness, balance, and expression. Now, wholeness itself entails a consistent attention to the unconscious, which requires that the acceptance of all aspects of the personality. This is usually quite difficult because we naturally tend to repress and reject what we find incompatible with our conscious attitude. So we tend to then project or ignore or punish the expressions of these kind of more negative characteristics. But the goal is to begin to see where these qualities exist in us and then how they guide our behavior. Balance itself refers to a resistance from one-sidedness, right? Either in the conscious egoic attitude or an overly unconscious one. And the idea here is that a continual expression of one over the other can lead to kind of a psychic injury of sorts. And then finally, expression refers mainly to the pursuit of one's kind of grander life's task in search of meaning, perhaps. And more specifically, I'm seeing more and more that creative action seems to be kind of the organ of the individuation process, helping us continually just metabolize and alchemize inner material, which Jung implies in this quote can make us feel most alive and connected to one another. So, how does all of this relate to the psychedelic experience? When it comes to wholeness, Panka's mystical experience questionnaire suggests that oneness and unity are consistent themes in mystical experiences. And because we use the MEQ as a viable kind of qualitative assessment of psychedelic experiences, we can then observe how they can uniquely disintegrate some of those egoic boundaries and allow the user to open up to like a feeling of connection to both the inner and the outer world. And then Panke and Richards have also suggested that psychedelic experiences can change one's conscious attitude by tying together emotion and intellect, kind of bringing a fullness to life. And because this is partly the goal of individuation, it seems clear that psychedelic use can initiate an openness to the entire spectrum of human experience, basically. And then finally, Aldous Huxley has said that mystical experiences can help individuals lead more creative lives, right? It's kind of well known and well supported that psychedelic compounds can elicit highly creative states, and the incorporation of creative expression into one's life after a psychedelic experience can be a valuable takeaway to from a psychedelic experience. And this can help us engage with our creative instinct more directly and experience an embodied kind of continued dialogue with the inner and outer world at once, right? So in general, I think that the connections between the concept of individuation and the psychedelic state essentially provide a secondary language for integration, taking an experience, a psychedelic experience that is beyond the clinical space and into an embodied life. And I think an understanding of these concepts as they relate to individuation can help us apply our insights to life and kind of come into our own life more authentically. So, kind of in summary here, I suggest that a thorough understanding of depth psychological concepts would probably greatly enhance the accessibility of growth through psychedelic experiences. Now, when it comes to psychedelic assisted psychotherapy training, we can see from the MDMA assisted psychotherapy manual provided by MAPS that Jungian therapy is listed as a potentially valuable tool, right? And so that's great. That's a good step in the right direction. And as to whether Jungian thought should be more or less explicitly explored is up for debate, but I suggest that it can be valuable, kind of including it more directly. So this made me curious about what it might look like for depth psychological ideas to be directly applied to the structure of a psychedelic experience. Now, I should stress that I don't mean to frame these as clinical interventions necessarily, nor am I suggesting that this is like a superior way of approaching the contour of a psychedelic trip. But in my curiosity, I decided to essentially map how I could see Jungian concepts interwoven into the process while using the language of the clinical structure. So, preparatory phases could involve understanding which archetypal images resonate most strongly with the user, as well as which complexes exist and what stories the user brings to an experience, right? And as with the unconscious mind's nature, this might not be abundantly clear immediately, and there might be some value in digging for that kind of information together. And then in the dosing stage, it might be that a particular user can better understand when and how to engage with certain figures, if at all. And then wholeness and symbolic language might be kind of readily embraced, opening the user up to newer perspectives while under the influence of the psychedelic. And then finally, Jungian concepts could kind of dance with existing integration practices by offering creative tools or maybe even directly Jungian applied um, techniques like dream analysis. And this could encourage a patient to continue their dialogue with what surfaced in the psychedelic state if it seems best for them. Now, I like to kind of stress again that these are just ideas and musings, and as someone not in the clinical space, at least yet, I don't necessarily have the full picture. But with that being said, and broadly speaking, I do want to reemphasize the importance of caution in approaching psychedelic interventions, right? Jung himself was actually quite skeptical of psychedelics, and he warned against what he called unearned wisdom. And he also suggested that their continued use could lead to an ability to call on ghosts and not get rid of them, his words, which is quite daunting. There might also just be differences in therapeutic frames between psychoanalytic and psychedelic therapeutic models, right? And these should be kind of understood and considered yeah, from the perspective of the clinician when bringing any Jungian techniques or tools into an actual session. And then finally, to stress again, I think a combination of the numerous psychotherapeutic tools that exist out there is likely key, and these will probably change from individual to individual. So the magic is kind of knowing when and what to use. So with all of this in mind, I think we'd benefit from actual research that explores the impact of Jungian psychology as it relates to psychedelic therapy. And in the meantime, I think those interested in better understanding this kind of model might want to do some self-directed reading, of course, or they can check out any program, website, or conference that deals with the application of Jungian ideas. There aren't many out there, but they are out there. And then finally, I'll re-stress kind of the central theme here. I do think that depth psychological tools may aid in the understanding of psychedelic experiences in all of its stages. And I'd like to leave you with a quote from Alan Watts that kind of references his personal meeting with Carl Jung. He says, he was a man who was thoroughly with himself, having seen and accepted his own nature profoundly. And I think that kind of speaks to the potential of Jungian psychoanalytic work, especially in the context of the therapeutic agents that we explore to better understand ourselves and the world. All right. At this point, I'd like to make some acknowledgments. The first being Kira Reynolds, my talk coach, for the help along this presentation's development. And I'd also like to thank my peers, Jack and Megan, for their feedback as well, along with PsychedelX and the IPN broadly for their consideration of my ideas and acceptance into this brief program. And then I also think that my work at Pacifica has kind of indirectly prepared me well for this talk. So I want to express my gratitude toward them as well. Here are a number of references to content and images that served in this presentation. There are quite many. And then finally, I wanted to thank you for watching and listening. You can reach me at any of these platforms if you'd like to contact me or stay in touch. But other than that, thanks again and have a great day.